Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Marvin Goldberg, and I am the Senior Vice President for Global Client Services with Workforce Mobility. I'm speaking to you from Hong Kong, welcoming you to this very exciting event, the inaugural event on behalf of the Asia Talent Mobility Alliance, or ATMA. Very excited to be joined today by a hugely esteemed and expert panel. But before we go into the setup and details and give you an idea of what we're going to be spending this hour discussing, just want to share with you a little bit about the association, the Alliance for Talent Mobility in Asia, or ATMA. ATMA is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to enhancing the innovation and development of the talent mobility industry in Asia. Several of us involved in the industry have come together to create the industry's first professional association for the Asia region, led by and promoted by people based in Asia, dedicated to global mobility in Asia. The mission of ATMA is to create the first global mobility trade association focusing solely on Asia, that is located in Asia, actively supports the talent mobility and relocation community in Asia, and is all about Asia talent mobility. The mission of ATMA is to be the authority on global mobility for both governments and business throughout Asia, to provide support to mobility professionals and stakeholders throughout Asia, through the facilitating communication, education, community, and advocacy, and finally to reflect, embrace, and promote the distinctiveness of Asian countries, cultures, industries, and individuals within the framework of global mobility. The vision of ATMA is to enhance the innovation and development of the talent mobility industry of Asia. So in short, ATMA has been founded to represent, advocate, innovate for the global mobility community throughout Asia. So we're delighted to have today's webinar as our inaugural event. We are finalizing the actual organizational structure of ATMA. You can follow the progress of that via the website where you would have registered to attend this webinar. That website address is Asia Talent Mobility Alliance, one word, .wildapricot.org. Fairly easy. It's a long email address, but a fairly easy one to remember. Asia Talent Mobility Alliance, one word, .wildapricot.org, and it's an HTTPS web link. So please do follow progress of the ATMA launch via that website. Please also find us on LinkedIn. We have an active LinkedIn page as well, which is constantly being updated. And membership will be opening up very soon for individuals who are actively involved with or interested in furthering talent mobility in Asia. So welcome everybody today. Now I'd like to cross over to introducing our panel. Joining me today are in alphabetical order would be Janet Chang, is the program manager for talent mobility in APAC for Netflix, and Janet's joining us today from Singapore. Hi, Janet. Janet has extensive years of talent mobility experience throughout the Asia Pacific region, and her career has covered roles in professional services and in-house, primarily in the manufacturing and entertainment industry sectors. And Janet has great passion in driving excellence in user experience and is very well known throughout the global mobility industry in APAC. Next up is Ella On. Ella is Senior Manager for APAC with BASF. Ella is speaking to us today from Kuala Lumpur. Hi, Ella. Thanks for joining us. Ella actually embarked on her relocation and global mobility industry career over 15 years ago, overseeing the APAC region. Ella is a Malaysian national and has been based in China throughout her career, which covers both service delivery side and in recent years in-house corporate role. She repatriated back to Malaysia very recently in 2021 and continues to build her expertise in the world of global mobility, striving to provide the highest levels of service possible. Delighted to have you join us today, Ella. And then last but by no means least, Lee Quain. Lee is Regional Director for Asia with ECA International. And Lee is, like me, speaking to you today from Hong Kong. So we got a good geographic spread across Hong Kong, are joining you guys today. Lee has been based with ECA International's Asia operations since 2003. He's been regional director for ECA International since 2009. ECA International as an organization provides mobility solutions for a world that's constantly moving, and as an organization is 100% focused on global mobility across the key areas of software, consultancy, training, helping companies manage and reward their international staff effectively. Lee led the establishment of ECA International in APAC, and he's a regular speaker at international HR conferences and seminars, equally regularly contributing to industry publications in the region. You will often find Lee quoted in the press on global mobility-related matters. So thank you one and all, my expert panel, for joining today. What are we talking about? We are talking today and addressing the timely and pressing topic of the global headwinds impacting relocation during the summer's peak season, under the rather auspicious title of the Summer of Discontent. And it is shaping up in several ways, in many ways, to be a summer of discontent. And today's panel will be looking at how we can best be dealing with the great potential for discontent being unleashed by these global headwinds that we're going to be discussing. Basically, with inflation and rising energy prices, transport disruptions, accommodation and education shortages, general supply chain and scheduling issues impacting the mobility industry across the board, and including in our region, the summer is shaping up to be one of the most challenging for our industry. Our expert panel today is here to discuss how these headwinds are affecting relocations in Asia, and to share their thoughts on best or better practices to mitigate those challenges. The structure for today will be we'll kick off with each participant, panelist, providing a quick overview of their respective companies and, where applicable, their global mobility programs in the region. And then we're going to pose two critical questions to our panel. The first will be, what in your view, generally speaking, has been happening and is likely to be happening near term with global mobility move patterns and demographics in APAC? That's the high-level question. And then question two, we'll be drilling down into the meat and potatoes of today's topic, which is, what are you seeing and hearing taking shape in terms of summer of discontent-related challenges, both within your respective organizations, and then just generally from colleagues and other companies in the region. That will then segue into whatever remaining time we have at that point for open discussion and a free exchange of ideas amongst the panel. And then we'll close off with some Q&A, depending on how much time we have. Do feel free to take advantage of the question feature in Zoom to pose questions you would like the panel to address during the session. If not, equally good, hold your questions to the end. Again, going back to the experience, the depth of experience represented by the individuals that we have joining us on this ATMA inaugural educational event really cannot be exaggerated. We have a very, very wide range of backgrounds and experience in the topic and in general in global mobility, from Janet, Ella, and Lee. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Lee to introduce yourself and your organization and build on that, please.
Thank you, Avram. Although I'm not too sure I need to do any further introduction of myself, given the fact that you did such a good job yourself. But basically, just to add on to that, as Avram mentioned, I'm responsible for ECA International's operations in Asia. I have been in the region itself for over 20 years now. And in the last few years, what we have seen is quite a large amount of upheaval, both prior to pandemic and also during the pandemic, in terms of how companies are moving staff around, and also where they're being moved to. So, for example, we saw leading up to the pandemic, obviously, an increase in greater variation in employee mobility, people moving, organizations moving away from the more traditional or typical assignment methods such as long-term assignments, moving towards more flexible options such as short-term assignments, permanent transfers, and so on. And then obviously with the onset of the pandemic, that continued, where we saw lots of organizations then embrace other types of moves such as virtual assignments or international remote working. So we have seen quite a large amount over the course of the last few years, and hopefully I'll be able to share some of what we've seen clients doing and some of what they've done well and what they may not have done so well, which hopefully I'll be able to share with you between now and when we finish.
Terrific. Thank you, Lee. Ella.
Yes. Hi, everyone. No introductions. Thanks, Avram, for doing that for us. But I'll just give a quick overview of our company, because for those who don't know BSF, we are a chemical company with over 100,000 employees globally around the world. Maybe a lot of you may not know what we do exactly, but actually a lot of things around you may have BSF products in it. So just a high context level on that. But from a mobility perspective, we have about 750 active assignments in APAC. And all of those are under the different types of assignment. Since we are chemical company, we have industrial sites. So we do have a large number of those on project-based assignments between 3 to 24 months period, which is probably more specific to us and perhaps our industry. But majority of our population is what Lee mentioned as well, is the traditional long-term assignments, followed by permanent transfers. So we're seeing a lot more of that increasing at this point in time. And our key locations for BSF in APAC is China, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong. And also to piggyback on what Lee just shared as well, we recently introduced the Employee Flex program. So we are looking at more flexibility into our programs. We've just rolled that out, to see how assignees want to decide themselves how to utilize the non-core benefits. And yeah, we're excited to launch that this summer, actually, on top of the Summer of Discontent, and monitoring the development and usage of the Flex program. So just a little bit overview of our company.
Terrific, thank you, Ella. We might come back to you and ask for the autumn of content to describe more of the Flex program.
Or winter.
Winter, exactly. Thank you for that. Janet.
Hi, I'm Janet, and like what Avram said, I'm based in Singapore. And first of all, I just wanted to say thank you, ATMA, for inviting me for that first webinar session. It is really a great honor. So, I guess I hope everyone on this webinar has a Netflix at home. So I don't really need to actually introduce about Netflix. So we are actually a global streaming entertainment company. We aspire to entertain the world. We have about 10,000 employees located over 28 locations in the 4 regions, trying to achieve our aspiration. So about 9% of the employee population is in APAC, with our primary hubs or larger hubs in Mumbai, Seoul, Singapore, and Tokyo. And in Netflix, we empower local country teams and we grow local talents. So on that perspective, we do not have a large international assignees population, even globally. And we have about 100 moves on an average a year. Out of which only 20% are international assignments. So we have the international assignment program, and we have also a permanent moves program, which covers international moves and domestic moves as well. So this is all I have. Thank you.
Excellent. We're going to move on to question 1, which is what, in your view, generally speaking, has been happening and is likely to happen near term with global mobility move patterns and demographics in APAC? So Lee, we're going to ask you to on that.
Okay. Thank you. And obviously, being a data company as we are, everything that I'm going to say today will hopefully be backed up by data. So what I will do is just share one or two slides briefly to talk about what we've seen in terms of some of the data that we've collected. So if you just allow me to share my screen ever so quickly. What we can see here is if I just go through to one of the first slides. So this is basically data from one of our recent policy surveys. So we run policy surveys on a regular basis with regards to trends about everything. And what we do on a biannual basis is run what we call a Global Mobility Now survey. So we did this earlier this year in 2022, just before locations in APAC started to really open up and reopen their borders once again after being closed for a while. But we ask a very simple question to companies. Firstly, we asked them, have they seen an increase, a decrease, or no change in the types of assignments over the course of the past 2 years? So if you look at this yellow chart in front of you, this is looking at the data as a early 2022 when we asked companies, did they see an increase or decrease in any of these types of moves? So if you have a look here, and if you see if the chart itself is below that dotted line, which indicates an increase. So if any of these bars are below, it indicates that this type of assignment has actually declined in the past 2 years. So obviously it's probably unsurprising to anybody who's listening in today that prior to 2022, so in the previous 2 years during the pandemic from 2020 through to 2022, the number of long-term assignments, number of short-term assignments obviously decreased. Commuter assignments quite surprisingly remained unchanged. Obviously this is a global survey, so I would have expected that to include within country commuters such as within the USA, Canada, India, and so on. And it would have also been within places such as Europe. But in Asia, we saw complete reduction or a cessation of commuter assignments cross-border. And obviously, unsurprisingly, during the pandemic, a large number of organizations started to use virtual assignments as a contingency method. Then we asked companies again to forecast what they were expecting to see over the course of the next 2 years. And what you can see from this is organizations, from my perspective, seem to be very optimistic about all types of mobility over the course of the next 2 years. Long-term assignments seem to be in vogue once again. So a significant number of companies are expecting an increase, expected to increase in popularity over the course of the next couple of years. Interestingly, we see virtual assignments starting to drop off. It shows to us that virtual assignments were seen very much as a contingency measure as part of dealing with the pandemic. So what we'll probably see is that will start to decline in popularity as other types of assignment begin to become much more feasible and acceptable to both companies and their assignees alike. So that's just a quick kind of like overview of that particular data that we're seeing.
Terrific. That's very, very helpful for setting the scene. Thank you so much. Janet.
I mean, you know, what Lee had showed us is pretty interesting. I'm just wondering, why didn't we see a bigger spike on the permanent transfer side? You know, it was a little bit surprising in terms of, you know, the outcome. So, anyways, yeah, what I, in my personal view, you know, and I think this is a topic that has been, you know, talked about in many webinars lately, is about, I think a lot of people mentioned about, you know, a lot of the moves are coming out from China, shifting to the other various parts of Asia Pacific. But I think in those forums, which I really totally agree with what many of those industry experts has actually, indicated, is I don't think China is going to lose its importance, in the region itself, because so many companies has actually built that infrastructure, in the country itself and the supply chain. So, but I personally think that companies may start to reorganize the way they allocate the roles, in the country itself, knowing that, China is actually going for a more zero COVID policy versus any other countries, which is learning to live with COVID. So, despite I don't see, there will be a major move, but, I think that there will be some change in the way companies actually locate their roles in China itself. And I also would see that there might be difficulties for companies to actually entice employees in taking on international assignments in China. The fact that many of them, would have known that how tough it is during COVID in China itself. So that to me, would be a big challenge for a lot of the companies. The other thing that, obviously I think that, we have recently heard a couple, or actually an increasing number of countries announcing this, digital nomad or something equivalent, to encourage more foreigners into their countries to probably build up, that so-called professional population. I mean, in our region itself, Bali, they have actually, hasn't been launched, but has been announced that the digital nomad visa can last as long as 5 years, and there's no individual tax compliance issue in that sense. But when I actually read that news, I was like thinking, what about corporate taxation? What is that going to, what does that mean to a company? So really, I think that, there will be increasing number of requests from employees, to explore remote working in the various countries that offer, such digital nomad equivalent status, and we have seen, tech industries, like embracing them or starting to embrace them. But I think that many companies will start to explore them. Still, then I think factors like corporate tax, inclusion, engagement, and even the kind of things that the kind of roles that we are talking about, will actually create some form of a barrier for companies to fully embrace remote working arrangement. So, I think that there will be a shift, but, just really waiting, excitedly as in how all of us, how this is going to evolve. Yeah.
Excellent. Those are a wealth of thoughts shared there. Thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to some of the points that you raised. Thank you, Janet. Ella.
Yes. Actually, if I can go back to Lee's slides just now, Lee, I may have missed it, but was that all industries across the board, or is it specific to majority industry?
It was all industry and all geography.
Okay.
So again, going back to one of the comments, Janet, to your comment as well, there are certain locations where we've probably seen permanent transfers being more widely adopted. So places such as perhaps Hong Kong, where we see more permanent transfers, or at least we did prior to the pandemic, as well as places such as Singapore. And we see that in other locations as well. So yes, the data itself was, there were no cuts. It was based on all of I think it was about 400 organizations who participated. And obviously it wasn't geographically influenced either.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you for sharing that, because I think, to Janet's point, it might be industry based, right? Like, why are we not seeing permanent transfers more on one side? But because we also see that from our industry, I mentioned earlier about us being more of a, chemical industry. We have our sites set up, and the talent that we need, is specific to being in that location. So, when we talk about virtual assignments and things like that, it might not be so permanent to, important to us, I guess, is our industry. But then more so, we're seeing the assignment, like still having the traditional assignment of a long-term assignment quite, the volume still being fairly high, I would say. Although I do see that the volume of permanent transfers is increasing, but more of a higher pace than you would see a long-term assignment model for our company. But I also think, when we talk about trends, I find it interesting to see about, we had the traditional assignment types that you mentioned on your slide, but I also foresee that a lot of companies are looking at developing new policy types, like different type of policy. Like virtual assignment never came before. Like the remote work policy was never in our vocabulary until pandemic hit. Then all of a sudden, companies are starting to put together a remote work policy. What's next, right? Like what other policy types are coming? And I think that might come, for example, you were talking, Janet, about finding talent might be challenging, but then we see that maybe there's a generational shift right now in terms of, how people are, I guess, getting excited about or having the want to travel, to have an international experience. And then companies are trying to find a program or assignment type that can accommodate these type of newly fresh graduates or internship program. So maybe, we know that people are trying to starting asking questions now, like what kind of benefits do we provide for these type of new, I guess, population that's looking to move internationally, perhaps. But yeah, so it seems like near term, I think interesting to see like what companies are coming up with policies, because we talk about core flex. We're just doing that now, but that's been the buzz for the past years, people talking about core flex policy. And then here we are just starting to do it now. And I think employee experience is still going to be one of the key, importance, I guess, for companies in terms of making sure that the policies are being administered properly and things like that. But yeah, that's what I'm seeing, at least observing from my end.
Just to add to my point, sorry, Avron, and sorry, just to come back to what Ella was saying. In that slide, what I was showing was really kind of like rates of growth of these types, but that didn't really show, if you look at a typical organization, most organizations will still heavily rely more on long-term assignments. As I said, this is typical. Many companies will differ. So even though we've seen the likes of maybe permanent transfers showing a much greater rate of increase than the likes of long-term assignment, for most organizations, as a proportion of their mobile workforce, they still are relatively small, albeit they're growing at a faster rate than other types, such as long-term assignments. And I think that's something that organizations need to be aware of when they look at statistics such as this and they see, 80% of organizations are reporting an increase in virtual assignments. Well, that may be 80%, but they're going from 0 to 1 person or 0 to 2 people, as opposed to their long-term assignment workforce, which may be 100, 200, or 300. So that's also something that's important to bear in mind.
That's a good point. But just to piggyback on that, but overall, specifically for Asia, because you see everything so expertly to an Asia lens, the data that you shared with us, I mean, is it accurate to say, do you foresee perm transfers actually outstripping long-term assignments now or in the near future?
No, not in the region overall, because I think permanent transfers do have a place, and for many organizations, they are very, very valuable. But they can only sometimes be used in certain locations. So for example, as I said, we see them quite more commonly used in places such as Singapore, where people are more willing to relocate on a one-way basis. But obviously we know that Asia is a very large region, and people may not be so willing to relocate on a permanent basis to other locations such as perhaps Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, India, and so on and so forth. So in those types of locations, it's going to be more more common for MNCs to use long-term assignments as part of their toolkit for managing moves into those particular locations.
Excellent, thank you. Well, as expected, each of our panelists has contributed some really interesting thoughts, which we could go off in any direction and drill into, but that will be for future webinars, because we need to get to the meat and potatoes part of the discussion, which we're about to. But just to summarize some of the highlights as just shared. Janet spoke eloquently and particularly about the possibility of changes in the way companies actually allocate roles in China and potential, just potential impact of what's been happening in China lately, particularly around the insistence on maintaining dynamic zero as a COVID policy and the likely potential knock-on effects of that. But again, at the same time, and I fully agree with you, Janet, I think we also need to be cautious about potential exaggeration for the degree to which companies can, will, and are in fact even able to disengage from China and ignore China and move, and break out of the China supply chain. But I think that's an important point. So China, I agree, absolutely will not be losing its importance as a destination anytime soon. There will be some significant changes. I absolutely think also agree. I think it's going to become harder across the board to persuade people to go. It's not going to be as easy in the past, but it's unlikely that we're going to see a significant dive or a cessation of mobility in China because of the because of many of the things that are going on, either geopolitical or the COVID level. Also interesting pointing out, digital, the development on digital nomads. When I saw the Bali announcement, I started doing investigations immediately. The idea of living tax-free in Bali for 5 years, I mean, who wouldn't want to actually look at that? But you quite rightly point to, we need to examine the fine print. Companies in particular need to examine the fine print. That's not yet fully available as far as I'm aware. The detail as to the implications from an employee point of view very important. And I think that ties very neatly with the digital nomad developments, forthcoming developments around digital nomads. In fact, ties very nicely to the point that made by Ella around how increasingly mobility worldwide, but no less in Asia, is transforming into and promoted, pushed primarily because of generational shifts in the makeup of workforce, is being pushed into being more and more about companies needing to pay attention. Mobility has always been about, from the beginning of the dawn of time, and I think forever, it will always be centrally about getting the right people in the right place at the right time. I think we all agree about that. But I think what absolutely has changed and what will continue to change and what Ella has drawn attention to is, and again, driven by the generation shifts, is also increasingly though, in terms of harnessing talent and persuading talent and recruiting talent. And recruiting talent is just one part of the equation. The harder part, in my view, always has been is retaining the talent. One thing to find it, and it's another thing to actually hang on to it, right? And that brings with it the necessity to actually develop and support it. And that's where mobility comes in. And I definitely see companies increasingly starting to understand that equation and actually use global mobility as a tool to not only recruit, but to actually develop and retain. But the link from digital nomads in particular to the point that I was making is on the increasing importance of employee experience as a driver in evaluating policy types, developing policy types, and becoming more creative, if you like, in creating policies that are fit for purpose and particularly fit for the purpose of attracting and retaining talent. And then, great final point from you, Lee, in terms of just answering a question around. We always need to be really careful. There's data, and you need to be careful how you interpret data and how you use data. And it's good to hear that validation of what I certainly have suspected that whilst there's correctly this a headline emphasis on the shift towards perm transfers and the increase in perm transfers overall as a policy type or a move type. In APAC, it's not yet, nearly an instance of that perm transfers have actually, replaced or outstripped the more traditional forms of assignment. And I think you very correctly point out that in particular is linked to there's a lot of factors, but that's particularly linked to simply to geography, to destination, to location. And I think particularly as a driver, with COVID as a driver, so much is in our world is impacted by COVID. And I think, it's definitely going to take a little while for us in Asia to live through what, that cliche, but very real concept of post-COVID. We still have to adapt to a truly region-wide period of normality post-COVID, because there's still parts of Asia that are significantly locked down, significantly restricted because of COVID. So yes, I think it's going to remain harder to persuade people to go to a lot of locations in Asia on a permanent basis for some time to come. So thank you very much, everyone, for your contributions in that regard. We're going to move on to question 2, which I'll keep referring to as my apologies to any vegetarians or vegans I'll be referring to as the meat and potatoes question, the central question at hand, right? What are we seeing taking shape in the summer of discontent related challenges, where we talked about in terms of, inflation, rising energy prices, disruptions to supply chain, housing costs, increases, scheduling issues in household goods, et cetera, et cetera. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Lee, to kick us off again on this section.
Okay, thank you very much. And once again, I shall start with hopefully some useful facts, or depends on whether or not you refer to them as facts or data. So once again, let me just share my screen and I'll go on to the next slide now. So there's a couple of challenges that we see with regards to organizations when it comes to managing their mobility policies. And here I'm I've chosen to focus specifically on areas around compensation and benefits. Because although there are obviously many facets associated with managing talent when they move, obviously trying to attract them to move in the first place, as you mentioned, Avram, then obviously getting them to physically relocate. And we know that there are obviously challenges associated with relocation at the moment, associated with the inflation, with costs, the difficulty of getting flights, for example, in comparison to pre-pandemic levels. But what I want to do here is obviously focus on when you obviously move somebody, you obviously need to determine a salary and benefits package. And as part of most assignments, most companies will still continue when it comes to a long-term assignment to revert to what we refer to at ECA as a home-based salary methodology, but many also refer to it as a balance sheet. And there are obviously areas that we see taking place over the course of 2022, which we think will have a considerable impact on both employee salary packages, but also from a global mobility or talent mobility manager, what you'll need to be cognizant of or aware of when it comes to doing salary reviews over the course of the remainder of this year. So one of which is obviously looking at protecting employee purchasing power. For most organizations, you'll typically include some form of cost of living adjustment if you're moving employees from one location to another. And so in this case, inflation is quite critical. So what I'm doing is sharing a little bit of information here in terms of typical inflation rates based on our cost of living research. And it's important to bear this in mind because expatriate inflation will often be very different to local national inflation because of different consumption habits, different items in the basket of goods. So here we're looking at our own data. And this is really looking at what we call a kind of like a pin chart, which shows in yellow at the bottom in each year what the lowest rate of inflation in the locations that we've covered in Asia Pacific. So this is basically a basket of countries from Japan all the way in the very north, all the way down to Australia and New Zealand in the very south. So typically at the bottom, you'll always see someone like Japan having the lowest rate of inflation. And then towards the top, in blue, you'll have your more kind of like, I suppose, developing economies, for want of a better word, places such as obviously Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Myanmar, which typically or traditionally have relatively high rates of inflation. And the green bar, the green dot, as you can see, is basically the median based on all of the locations in the region. So what we've seen is obviously leading up to the pandemic, generally a downward trend if you look at that median. So both at the minimum level, inflation was actually dropping, and in some cases it was actually becoming negative. But even at a median level, back in 2020, throughout about the 15 to 18 locations in the region, your typical rate of inflation was negligible, about 1 to 2%. We've then seen a recovery or an increase in 2021 as the supply chain issues start to obviously unfold. And then if we look once again into 2022, we can see a continued increase. It doesn't really seem to be that significant in 2022. And a couple of reasons to share here. Number one, this is based on our March 2022 cost of living data. Obviously, we might see a continued rate of increase when we come to do our September survey, which may show an even more pronounced rate of increase. But what is also important to bear in mind is that while we hear lots of headline rates of inflation reported in places such as the US and the Europe, where they're talking about inflation being double digits, even in places such as Germany or the UK or USA, we're not necessarily seeing that throughout most of Asia at the moment. And that's possibly due to factors such as government intervention. In many items in our basket of goods, such as rice, gasoline, etc., in many developing economies, governments have intervened to suppress the rate of price growth by increasing subsidies in order to obviously protect consumers from the full increase of pricing. So that's something to bear in mind. But we will probably see a continued increase in the rate of inflation throughout the rest of 2022. But once again, I think that we won't see the rates of inflation that we've seen in Europe and North America throughout Asia, with the exception of a few locations, such as places like obviously Sri Lanka, Laos, Cambodia, etc. The more kind of like the locations which are more prone to the impact of inflation. Now, another factor that organizations are quite interested in is obviously housing costs. And Ella and Janet, I think you'll probably come onto this in more detail obviously from an end user perspective. But one of the most regular queries that we received from clients over the course of the first 6 months of this year were organizations based in Singapore coming to us and saying that rental inflation is increasing significantly. And just anecdotally, I was speaking to one of my friends who relocated to Singapore last year, and they are in the process of negotiating their lease. And they told me overnight that their landlady has requested a 40%, that's 40% increase in rent. But just to share some information with you here, so what we're looking at here is, again, based on our data that we collect, where we look at districts which are commonly inhabited by expatriates and properties which are commonly inhabited by expatriates. So this is obviously expatriate districts, and we're looking at condos as opposed to HDB or properties. But what you saw is that prior to pandemic, 2015 seemed to be the high point or the zenith of accommodation costs, and then gradually you saw a decline. What we have then seen is since then, in 2021, a recovery once again, and even in 2022, that recovery has continued to increase, or that rate of recovery has continued to increase. So we have obviously seen an increase, and rents in 2022 are significantly higher than they were back in 2020 and even in some of the pre-pandemic years as well. But what's also important to bear in mind is that at this point in time, in many of the districts, rents are still lower than what they were at their previous peak. So that's something that's quite interesting. And then the final point from me is looking at location or hardship allowances. Some organizations have discontinued paying these, particularly if we're sending staff to obviously, places like Western Europe, North America, Australia, and so on. But there are still many locations in the region which typically will qualify to receive what we refer to at ECA as a location allowance, but also commonly referred to as QOL or hardship allowances. And when we come to do our updates later this year, I think 3 locations which are likely to be a focus for us are places such as mainland China, but specifically Shanghai, where we've obviously seen the lockdowns there have a significant impact on living conditions and therefore its attractiveness. So therefore that might prompt an increase or an adjustment in that location's location allowance recommendation. Likewise, we're seeing Hong Kong. Again, Hong Kong has unfortunately, and me and Avram have probably lived through this over the course of the last few years, since 2018 through to 2019 and the protests, and now obviously with political change and the impacts again of our kind of like dynamic zero COVID policy, that's impacting living conditions and once again the degree of attractiveness of Hong Kong as a destination. And elsewhere in the region, I think one of the key locations of note will be Sri Lanka, where we've seen a significant rate of obviously political upheaval over the course of the most recent months. That's led through to an impact on everybody's day-to-day lifestyles. So these are areas which we think we'll see or we think organizations will need to be focusing on when they come to review their salary packages over the course of the remainder of this year. So once again, I'm going to stop sharing there, and I'm going to hand over to the more, I suppose, coal-facing experts who deal with these issues on a more regular basis. So I'll hand back to Janet and Ella so they can provide some more practical input.
That's great, Lee. Thank you so much. There's such a wealth of information that's been shared by everybody that we're actually a little bit under the gun in terms of timing. So what I'm going to ask Ella and Janet to do is, as you address this question and focus on your particular areas, could you combine describing what you see as the challenges in addition to your sharing your thoughts around approaches to mitigate or improve negative consequences of any of these hardships? Because we've only got 10 minutes left. So with that, I'm going to call on Janet to kick us off.
Yeah. Okay. So just to write on what Lee had showed on, I guess, to many people in this summer, I think Singapore is the location that stands out the most in terms of this discontent, because not only is rental price going up, and we have like agents who are not willing, landlord's agent not willing to co-broke, which was, the previous market practice for rental above a certain amount. So I think, one of the most critical questions for, in-house corporate talent mobility team, of course, is, are we going to just take the change, right? Are we going to just take that increase? Just to share with you from a Netflix perspective, we get the same data, to say that it has increased. I guess for us, the primary thing is to remove the distraction from our employees. So we kind of have just rolled out, updated our housing data. We adopted the housing data, and we even have to just take on those additional agents' commission, when it comes to having to get our employee the right housing while they move to Singapore and be able to settle. So Ella, what about BASF?
Yep. when you talk about summer of discontent, Singapore was the nail hitting it. It was so challenging to deal with Singapore this summer, and it still continues to be so currently. So Janet, I think what you shared is a good perspective on how tech companies are probably handling it. Whereas I feel like for us, we're taking more of a passive approach when we look at the housing tables, right? Just to share with everyone, we actually updated our tables just recently as of April, right? And it was quite an increase as well, I would say. And the challenges that we saw this summer was that it's not that they couldn't find properties. They were able to find it within the budget. It's just that it becomes a bidding war. It's who can close it first, or, like, how can we move this forward? And so in that sense, we had to do an investigate. We really took our time to review the data. We took time to investigate with our suppliers and data providers to make sure that, hey, is it true that we really, like, our housing allowance is not where, it's not sufficient, right? Because we have quite a high volume in Singapore. So we needed to make sure that whatever decision we make is the right one for everyone, because it will set precedent. And so we ended up doing the investigation. I think this allows us to make a decision that's justified, right? And in that sense, we actually found that our housing tables were still able to find sufficient housing, and we didn't make any changes. But we will be reviewing the property, the housing allowance tables on an annual basis. So we will be addressing it as time goes on. But we were also conscious, like making sure that we didn't react very quickly. Yes, it slows down the process, but at least we're doing the decision making by investigating the data as well.
I just want to add, it doesn't mean that I didn't do any investigation.
Oh, I believe you, Janet.
But one thing, no, just kidding. But one thing I just wanted to add is, because of post-pandemic, right?
Yep.
A lot of companies has actually gone into hybrid working arrangement. I believe like almost, many companies are doing so. So as a result, I think there is a change in the needs, be it whether it's a permanent move or be it is international signees. I think they are looking for a slightly bigger place right now. Is more so, maybe in the past they would tell you, oh, I'm expecting a guest to visit me, so I want an additional room. But right now it's really about their ability to work from home, that space away from the family that they could concentrate. I think this is a new additional needs that has to be factoring when we actually think about housing for our employees post-pandemic.
Absolutely, good point. Ella, I have a question for you in terms of BSF operating in so many locations, but certainly very big in both Hong Kong and China. What's happening on the hardship front? Going back to Lee's pointing out that they expect, that we're expecting, some pressure in that regard.
Yep. For us, Hong Kong was where we heard most noise or feedback from our employees when they talked about the quality of living allowances. Right? I believe, Lee, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the data, when you check, there's obviously a lot of data points that's being checked in order to update your quality of living index. Then in Hong Kong, I understand that it was better, where people's quality of living allowance all of a sudden dropped. And maybe it's because the protest stopped. I don't know, but just thinking it dropped, and there was still a lot of concerns that we're hearing from people saying on the ground, this is not the case. It's, and then what we had to do was, we had to do an ad hoc check-in again at that point in time. So it's not to say that we don't do anything, but as long as, if we are hearing enough voices from our employees, we do want to ensure that we address them. And so looking at it on an ad hoc basis, and then sure enough, at the end of the investigation, then it was in fact adjusted. So we were going through these changes, it was impacting us, but luckily towards the end of the summer, that kind of quieted down because we did this investigation. So Lee, maybe you can add on to that.
No, you're right. And when organizations such as ourselves, when we come up with these measurements of locational hardship allowances, they are very much often the sum of moving parts. So what we've seen ourselves is in the run up to 2020, our score for somewhere like Hong Kong was rising on the back of factors such as the impact of the protests, and also that year also coincided with a significant bad weather year. And you may look at it and say, well, what's weather got to do with it? But Hong Kong, as we know, gets affected on a regular basis by typhoons, and they have a disruptive impact on people. Schools close, shops close, businesses close, public transportation closes down, and so on. So they also can have a similar impact. And if there's an increase in either the frequency or the severity of natural disasters, that will also cause scores to go up. So what we actually saw in about 2020 or even 2021 was that even though the score was going up in other factors such as, you know, the closures in the closures that were due in Hong Kong due to immigration and the inability to either to come back to Hong Kong. But at the same time, because of the decline in protests, because of the decline in bad weather events, that was actually kind of like offsetting the impact of COVID. So it's quite interesting. And I appreciate it's also a very difficult conversation to have with an employee when you say, well, yes, COVID is obviously impacting Hong Kong seriously, but there's no protests this year as opposed to last year, or there are fewer typhoons than there were last year. So it's quite difficult to have that kind of like rational conversation and explain, you know, these allowances are the sum of, you know, looking at multiple factors and not just focusing on one specific one.
Thank you, Lee. Gosh, well, my key learning, well, I've learned a lot from the session, but we've got 3 minutes to go. One of my key learnings on behalf of ATMA is that we need to consider to make these webinars 90 minutes rather than 60 minutes because there's just so much good discussion and sharing. And we've actually got a number of questions, but one that has been put through here from participants. And I'm going to quickly throw this one out to the panel because interactivity and participation is one of the driving things that we want to be promoting within, amongst participants and in ATMA. So literally the message is thank you so much for robust and honest sharing, Janet, Ella, and Lee. In case you have time, the questions around virtual assignments. Great to hear that traditional expat assignments will continue. Can each of you speak just a little bit about what constitutes a virtual assignment for your company, if you have such? And curious whether there's a cultural difference between perhaps the German company's approach to the idea of virtual assignments than American companies. So quite a big question, but 1 minute each, Ella and Janet. So we'll start with you, Janet.
Okay, I thought alphabetically would be Ella. Okay, anyways, we do not have a formal so-called a virtual assignment in Netflix. But where I personally don't see why is there a virtual assignment? To me, a virtual assignment would just means that someone in another location trying to cover another job in another location, not really a formal assignment per se. So this is not something, this is something to me is very normal in a lot of organizations and definitely very normal in Netflix. However, I think the challenge with virtual assignment, if you want to call those, is with engagement and inclusion. And so what I have observed that, a couple of my colleagues who are probably, working from another country, covering maybe this region, they will probably have to take a short-term assignment to the country, to the local country, build their relationship with the local stakeholders. And then with that relationship, they will return to their home country and then do that remotely. But it will still be a challenge. They themselves say it will still be a challenge, maybe because of time zone primarily. So, that's my experience so far with a virtual so-called assignment, but we do not have a virtual assignment in Netflix.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Ella, the last minute is yours.
No, it's same for me. I want Lee to finish this off, but it's the same for me, for Janet, exactly the same. We don't have virtual assignments. In fact, even for remote assignments, remote working is already something we don't talk about. So it's, going to virtual, I think it's even beyond at this point in time. beyond what we're looking at.
Thank
So
you.
I'll leave it to Lee.
So Lee, before you answer, full disclosure to our audience participation, this is a topic that Lee and I discuss quite often, and we think very, very alike on this. So Lee, I turn it over to you to bring us home on this question.
So I'll use more politically correct language than you and I normally use on the matter. But basically, from our perspective, and again, I agree with what Janet mentions. It's in terms of a person is present in one location, but performing a role for an entity in another country. And I think they're great from a contingency point of view, but from a long-term feasibility perspective, it's very difficult to do so. It might work if you are doing a virtual assignment being based in Singapore for somewhere such as Indonesia or Malaysia. It's not going to work when you're multiple time zones away, because you're not going to be able to establish that that camaraderie, so to speak. So there is a place for it, but I do think that they are still very much contingency. Once organizations and once people are much more able to freely move across borders, both people and their employers will seek to use other types, commuters, short-term assignments, even long-term assignments, as opposed to virtual assignments.
Terrific. Thank you for that. We are 1 minute over. As I said earlier, we could easily carry on discussing this for another half an hour and have lots more to share. So you know what? We will schedule another session. And fair warning to both Ella and Janet that you can prepare yourselves for an invitation for a further discussion, perhaps with a different twist. Lee, your good self too. Thank you so much to Janet, Ella, and Lee for giving up your time and being so generous with your sharings today. I'm very sure that all participants have found this of great interest. I know I certainly have. It just remains for me to thank all those who have dialed in today. Please do send us your comments and observations. Please do go to https Asia Talent Mobility Alliance oneword.wildapricot.org and follow what's happening in ATMA as we move towards opening up memberships and subscriptions, which will be happening very shortly. And also do find us on LinkedIn as well. Once again, Lee, Janet, Ella, thank you so much for this session. And thank you for our behind the screen Wizard of Oz for making the technicals work. That will be our good friend Steve Burson. And to everybody else who's joined us, have a good day or evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Thank you.